What triggers a Hoover? This is a most important video because one of the most fundamental questions that gets asked of me is, will I be hoovered? Will he be back? Will she return? Is that the end? Will I be left alone? And I always explain to people that the governing factors in that regard are two. One, has there been a Hoover trigger? And if so, has the Hoover execution criteria been met? The first fundamental consideration is, has there been a Hoover trigger? If there is no Hoover trigger, there can be no Hoover, and therefore it is important for you to understand how Hoover triggers happen and your part in them, because by understanding that, you will then be able to better improve your no contact regime. There are numerous factors which govern whether we will attempt to Hoover you post-escape or post-disengagement. Some of these factors determine the style of the Hoover, whether it be malign or benign, and also how often the attempts will be made. There are several considerations which have a material impact on whether a Hoover will occur, and therefore the most significant one in terms of the beginning factor is whether there is a Hoover trigger. And for there to be a Hoover trigger, it revolves around whether you have entered one of our spheres of influence, or more than one. Imagine, if you will, me. Now, I know that you do this often, as I am your guilty little secret, but we haven't got time for that at the moment. Here I am, sat at home, or in the office, or walking between bars. Let us take an instance of me, your erudite narrator, being in a bar. What is my sphere of influence? To be accurate, there are actually several. They vary in applicability and range. All of these spheres of influence are applicable with regard to the Hoover trigger, because if you enter one or more of these spheres of influence, you will, underline and repeat, will cause a Hoover trigger, which means that there is then the potential for a Hoover to take place. No Hoover trigger, definitely no Hoover. Hoover trigger activated, potential for there to be a Hoover. The Hoover trigger is the starting point. So, what are these spheres of influence? The first is the physically proximate sphere, namely those who are within earshot. That is the closest sphere of influence, and unsurprisingly the most dangerous for you. It is within the sphere of influence when the full range of charismatic and magnetic charms can be deployed in order to pull you back into my influence. Anybody who I can speak to or listen to, be sat with or dine with, stand next to or be near, enters my first sphere of influence and causes a Hoover trigger. The second sphere is the eye line sphere. This is the sphere where I can see you or you can see me. We may be across the street, on the other side of a field, up in an office, walking across a plaza. Maybe I'm across from you on the piste. If we can see you or you can see us, then you are in the second sphere. I may not be able to communicate with you other than perhaps to shout or wave flags at you or set off flares, but it remains a sphere of influence. Accordingly, this is why a Hoover trigger is activated when we may not be able to speak directly with them, but we can position ourselves across from your house, and therefore when we see you on the other side of the street or waiting across the square from where you are when you leave work. The third sphere of influence is our reach through our coterie and our lieutenants. Whether these people are our friends, inner or outer circle, colleagues, minions or family, if they operate as our lieutenants or our coterie, they form part of a sphere of influence. If you speak to the people, therefore operate in their first sphere, or they see you or you see them, therefore in the second sphere, you are then caught within my third sphere of influence, and thus there is a Hoover trigger. Rest assured that news of your appearance in the spheres of my lieutenants and my coterie will be relayed to me. This may be in person, by telephone, text, or email message, but the news will reach me. This also allows me to send information to you by proxy, as my coterie and lieutenants tells you about what I am doing, who I am with, and so on and so forth. The fourth sphere of influence is our reach to the telephone. I do not mean by text messages or FB Messenger, but actually speaking on the telephone. Whilst we may be thousands of miles from you, unseen and not physically proximate at all, the fact you are speaking to us allows us to extend our reach in an effective way through the use of the telephone. FaceTime and Skype and similar applications fall within this fourth sphere as well. Next, there is the fifth sphere of influence, which manifests through the sending of text messages, emails, letters, notes wrapped around bricks thrown through your window, smoke signals, etc. There is no actual speaking to one another. There is no third party involved. There is no physical proximity. This is the fifth sphere. Finally, there is the sixth sphere of influence, which is my beautiful mind. You may pop up in my mind for no reason whatsoever, arising as a consequence of an intrusive thought. Alternatively, it might be that I hear a song which reminds me of you. Or I walk past where you used to live and I am reminded of you. In all other respects, I may well have deleted you from my mind post-disengagement or post-escape, but then something happens, either triggered by a reminder or just a random intrusive recall, and there you are, in my mind and in my thoughts, and therefore you have entered the sixth sphere of influence, and thus there is a Hoover trigger. Accordingly, if you reflect on all six of these spheres, you will see that if you have a robust no-contact regime which keeps you out of spheres 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, you will vastly reduce the risk of there being Hoover triggers. You will also note that you can never eradicate the risk of a Hoover trigger because of the existence of the sixth sphere of influence. Namely, I may be reminded of you or just happen to think about you, and therefore there is that Hoover trigger. But as you can determine from what I have explained, the more robust your no-contact regime, the fewer spheres of influence you can enter, and ideally, you should only ever be in the sixth sphere of influence, because you have ensured your no-contact regime keeps you out of spheres 1 to 5. Following your escape or your disengagement, we will operate all of these spheres in an attempt to Hoover you. Once you appear in any or all of these spheres of influence, there is a Hoover trigger, and this will then encourage us to effect a Hoover subject to the separate consideration of the Hoover execution criteria, which I will mention and discuss in a separate video. Thus, if you have been effecting no contact and then I see you on a bus travelling along the high street, you have entered my second sphere of influence. You have come to my attention. You are on my radar. You have caused a Hoover trigger. Whether I then wave at you to get your attention or run along the road to catch up with the bus and board it so I can bring you to my first sphere, or completely ignore you, all depends on the applicability of the Hoover execution criteria. However, the fact that you have sailed close to me and appeared in my sphere does two things. Once it alerts me to you, I may have been distracted with other sources of fuel, but you entering my sphere of influence makes you game for a Hoover trigger, or rather game for a Hoover because there has been a Hoover trigger. Secondly, it awakens the mixture in you, that addictive quality that we imbue in you through our nefarious seduction of you, which then causes various memories to awaken inside of you, your emotional thinking surging and spiking, thoughts and feelings which make you vulnerable to our overtures once again, because as you know, your emotional thinking wants you to engage with us contrary to your best interests. If the Hoover execution criteria are met, we will then attempt to Hoover you. We are reminded of you, and this calls into mind the potent Hoover fuel that is offer. You're also at a heightened risk of the Hoover succeeding because of the effect of your emotional thinking. Sometimes we look to draw you into our sphere of influence. If If we wait around outside where we know you work, we're trying to draw you into this sphere of influence. More often, however, it is you that enters our sphere of influence, either deliberately or inadvertently. For example, you may decide you need to return some of our property and you call around to drop it off. Bad move. You've entered our first sphere of influence by coming to see us and providing this property. There is a Hoover trigger, and subject to the Hoover execution criteria, you may well be hoovered. Alternatively, it is late at night and we are on your mind, but you are not on ours, and you cannot help but send a text asking us how we are doing. By doing this, you have entered our fifth sphere of influence. Thus, there is a Hoover trigger. Any step or act which brings you to our attention, whether in person or on the phone, through others or through technology, is you entering our sphere of influence and triggering the potential for there to be a Hoover. You, of course, can influence how many of these spheres of influence operate with regard to you. Stay out of our way and ensure that we do not know where to find you, and you will prevent spheres 1 and 2 from working. Ensure that you are never mentioned to our friends and you avoid any contact with those who are our lieutenants in our coterie, and you destroy the third sphere. Avoid that temptation to ring us and you destroy the fourth. Ensure you never message us, do not send emails, or even an application request, and the fifth sphere is counted. The only one which you have no influence over is the sixth sphere. You may just pop into our minds from time to time, and there is nothing that you can do about that. You should draw some slight comfort, however, from the fact that post-escape and post-disengagement, if you have survived the initial Grand Hoover, then you will not pop into our minds that often, unless there is a fuel or malice obsession. Following the initial Grand Hoover and absent an obsession, we will have eradicated you from our mind and be focusing on alternative sources of fuel. There, of course, remains a risk of a Hoover trigger. That is why we never truly go away, because of the sixth sphere of influence, but the risk is vastly reduced. Liken the spheres to zones, which if you stay out of, you do not alert us to your presence and do not activate your mixture, your emotional thinking. Step inside one and you trigger the risk of a Hoover for the reasons outlined above. Your aim is to ensure that you remain free of post-disengagement and post-escape Hoovers, and to know these spheres of influence exist and to stay out of them. Of course, we do make it harder than you think, but that is a different matter for discussion.